The railroad was the primary artery for all activity in and out of the Ranger oil field. People and equipment had to arrive before wells could be built. To handle the oil as it was pumped out, storage tanks and pipelines had to be put into place. To process and prepare the oil, the refineries had to be built. To get the oil flowing, more pipelines had to be laid. All that required a constant stream of hardware, lumber, steel, tools, and personnel, which only the railroads could provide. The railroads were also the only source of the consumer goods demanded by the families of the laborers and their conflicting demand for construction products for homes. There was no oil without the railroad. This map shows the towns that existed in Eastland County prior to 1917, as well as the railroad, singular, that already existed. There were only 5 incorporated towns in Eastland County. Ranger was not one of them. The whole county population in 1910 was just over 23,000. While populations had probably increased somewhat in 7 years, it was not substantial. We're going to be building on this map as we go through the presentation. Ranger was an unincorporated village with a pre-boom population of about 800 and another 1,000 in the countryside. The boom brought as many as 100,000 people, overwhelming the ability of Eastland County to feed and house them. Many solutions to ease the pressure were attempted by the forward-thinking citizens of Ranger and the surrounding area. One of the most productive solutions came from the relationship between the railroads and the oil companies. The oil workers were desperate for a way to get to their work sites, while the oil companies were desperate for a way to move the oil to refineries in the South. The railroad solved both their problems by directly expanding railroad service to the oil fields. This is the story of the Ranger short lines, the towns that were built alongside them, the development and promoters, and the frustrations, including the embargoes. As new wells were opened, the people needed a way to get to the work sites, and the oil companies needed a way to get the oil out. Initially, the area was overwhelmed with camps and unincorporated communities. People just set up a shack wherever there were a few empty square feet. It was not sustainable. People couldn't get to the well sites. Oil companies could not get the oil out. Extracted oil was often stored directly on the ground in pools because they couldn't move it. Roads were seldom good enough to transport the materials to build the wells. Tank cars to ship by rail were both scarce and expensive. Well site selection had as much to do with the proximity to a railroad station, or at least a road, as it did geology. Transporting workers in and oil out became a priority, but the Texas and Pacific Railroad was unable to keep up with demand. Here we see horses being used to haul equipment and squatters' shacks near a well site. Horses were not a viable option. Where there was no railroad, it took many heavy horse teams to bring the equipment in. Often valued at $600 or more per span or pair, with an equal amount invested in the harnesses, these horses were so valuable their owners would dress them in finery equivalent to their worth. Horses had a weakness, however. Their hooves became subject to rot under the influence of the oil. Oxen were often used instead because their cloven hooves did not rot, and their slow, steady pulling kept the heaviest loads moving on the worst roads, making them a staple of the Ranger workforce. Soon, purpose-built railroads also transported the heavy equipment used to build wells, refineries, and pipelines. Many companies, such as the Cisco and Northeastern, came into existence only to build railroad spurs and serve the petroleum industry. This important spur-building function by the railroads included the construction of entirely new communities to alleviate the pressure of crowding and get the workers closer to the work sites. It also meant the oil was closer to its shipping point. The result was the creation from nothingness into thriving villages, and then abandonment back into nothingness at the bust. In early 1919, Jake Hayman and Frank Kell began building the Wichita Falls, Ranger, and Fort Worth Railroad, commonly called the Hayman-Kell. Beginning in Ranger, they worked north and south simultaneously, intending to open the route from Dublin to Wichita Falls at the same time. Both cities offered connections to national railroads. The railroad didn't quite make it to Wichita Falls, ultimately completing 76 miles from Dublin to Breckenridge. By July 1920, the route was open and a multitude of problems were solved through the construction of spur towns like Breckwalker and Jaykaman. Admittedly, they were not very creative in their naming scheme. This railroad operated until March 1922. There were three associated problems here. There was nowhere for the workers to live, it was hard to get to the well sites, and it was hard to get the oil out. By building new towns on the new spurs, Hayman could solve all three problems. Hayman would prepare his towns to be occupied at the same time the railroad was complete. He made it easy to move in by preparing town sites complete with stores and other amenities, ready for move-in when the spur opened. As the railroad neared each new spur, Hayman would have lumber and supplies laid out, plats drawn up, sewer, power, and other basic utilities installed. The day the railroad opened, the plats were ready to go on sale and the land was ready to live on, short of buildings actually being built. But all the material was laid out ready for that as well. With well-prepared advertising campaigns and conditions suited to this type of situation, Hayman was in a remarkable position to sell his purpose-built villages. Promotion was an essential part of why people arrived on the first day and why they were willing to pay thousands of dollars for what was essentially an empty lot on a bare patch of desert. The opening day of sales was set to coincide with the day the railroad opened its connecting service. Before the opening day, the companies ran half-page advertisements for a week or more that extolled the virtues of purchasing plats in a particular new town. The ads themselves are masterpieces of propaganda. The new town is closer to oil fields, has better untapped fields, there were more jobs and new business opportunities, a bargain at any price. When examined closely, it becomes typical advertising hype that does not say anything but is very exciting. Jump on the bandwagon and join the hullabaloo. On the first day, they offered free or reduced round-trip fare and even had a band on the train to create the appropriate excitement. Celebrations in the new town with a picnic created a festive, fair-like atmosphere. Even those who were not inclined to buy a lot when they got on the train might become motivated to do so if the appeal were a good fit. Reports indicate that many of these communities became towns of 2,000 to 5,000 people on their first day of existence. Boyce House reports that it was even possible to establish a bank with nothing more than a safe under a tent. Building towns from scratch was not for everyone. Other entrepreneurs tried building railroads with connections to many pre-existing small towns in the area. The most famous of these railroad builders was John Ringling of circus fame. His Ringling Short Line connected Mangum, Eastland, Gunsight, Wayland, and Necessity to Wichita Falls. The final remnant of his presence in the area today is Ringling Lake. At Necessity, the population increased from 200 to over 5,000 because of railroad promotion and co-located well sites. Another short line that operated briefly in the region was the Cisco and Northeastern, operating between Cisco and Breckenridge. Cisco native R.Q. Lee ran his Cisco and Northeastern to Breckenridge, establishing the town of Lee Ray, the Lee part for him and the Ray part for his associate Walter. The Cisco and Northeastern was the first short line started due to the boom, with work starting in December 1918 and completing 28 miles from Cisco to Breckenridge in 1920. In 1927, the CNN became part of the Texas and Pacific Railroad. Throckmorton Station, seen here, was built in 1928. All of the new towns are considered ghost towns today. The pre-existing towns fared little better. Humbletown is now a neighborhood in Cisco. Some are still considered towns, but with populations like 6 in Gunsight and 25 in Kokomo, an argument could easily be made for their demise. Likewise, the railroads have vanished. Some have even been incorporated into the larger T&P or MKT, but for the most part, even the tracks are no longer present. It may be hard to understand the need for all these short lines without looking at the magnitude of the situation. It's one thing to say the area was overwhelmed with newcomers, but that doesn't really mean anything. Here, Boyce House compares the California gold rush, which had about 10 million in production for the entire gold rush, to the Ranger oil boom with about 90 million in production each year. A few other numbers demonstrate how different they were. The California gold rush encompassed the northern half of the state, while the Ranger boom covered about 40 square miles. The gold rush included 40 to 50,000 miners, very few of whom brought their families. Though estimates go as high as 100,000, Eastland County gained at least 40,000. That is about the same number of people, but at Ranger they included wives and children who required amenities like schools and shops, so the demand for oil field supply and personal goods were competing. T&P was the primary rail service during the first 2 years of the boom. It did not take long for the shipments of oil, construction materials, and consumer goods to overwhelm them. For T&P, each train had so many freight cars attached that personnel could not unload incoming cars before the next train arrived, causing traffic jams all along their tracks. When congestion or interference prevents operations, there's an option of stopping traffic at another station to manage the flow. This type of stoppage is called an embargo. T&P kept Ranger under embargo almost continuously for nearly 2 years, allowing freight traffic by permit only. Through embargo, T&P controlled how many rail cars entered Ranger during these critical first 2 years of the oil boom. This in turn determined the amount of material available, not just for derricks, but for casing, drills, and supplies for building pipelines, refineries, storage tanks, and housing. It controlled the number of bricks for building roads and new stores, as well as food, clothing, and consumer goods. Fortunately, the number of cars allowed through was not small. Ranger bounded to the second highest earning station in T&P's stable in 1919, second only to New Orleans. Ranger jumped from $66,000 in revenue in 1914 to $8.1 million in 1919. Ranger even had $100,000 more in passenger sales than New Orleans, even under embargo. In May 1920, the Hayman-Kell opened a southern route to Dublin that linked San Francisco and St. Louis via the Texas Central. The extra tracks relieved the congestion somewhat. So let's take a look at the map. There has been a lot added to it since that first slide with a handful of towns and one railroad. I didn't even talk about the MKT, the Missouri, Kansas, Texas, because it is still active as part of Union Pacific, and it was a large national rail. The short lines, however, enabled goods and people to reach the places they needed to be. In fact, 6 businesses based wholesale operations out of Ranger to service their smaller shops in the spur communities and the oil camps. While the town was growing, the rail and oil companies invested in physical infrastructure, building short lines, spurs, and outlying bedroom communities. T&P built a new depot, while Hayman-Kell built a roundhouse. Both added multiple tracks into town. By the end of the boom, the T&P connected the country to Ranger on an east-west line, while the Hayman-Kell connected it on a north-south line. Numerous short lines and spurs enabled new wells to be built, oil to get transported out, and housing for workers and their families near their work sites. Those are the short lines at Ranger. Thank you for your attention. Are there any questions?